The next trick I'm going to show you is something I get asked all the time, which is how do I get those kind of vivid yet unsaturated muddy tones in my pictures. Now I came across this just from, I don't know, just messing around, clicking some buttons, trying to come up with something new. And basically all I do is I take the background layer and I duplicate it as usual. And then I take this top layer and I set the blending mode to multiply. Now again, technically I don't know what this means, but it makes everything look a bit more saturated and darker and more vivid. But a little trick I do to this top layer is I then desaturate it to the point where it's almost at the bottom. And then I duplicate the very, very back layer. So now I've got 3 layers: the multiply layer, the background layer, and the duplicated background layer. And then that middle one in the sandwich there, I turn the saturation down just a little bit as well. Okay, so now we see the image starting to come along, right? So what I'm going to do is on this multiply layer, I'm going to do my little trick of the eraser tool and just go over the parts that I want to bring out. So for this picture it'd be the eyes, the background, a little bit of his hair, and a little bit under his nose, and the lip. But the reason why I duplicated the very background layer and then desaturated it a little bit is because the top multiply layer is so desaturated that if I erase part of it and just the normal background layer shows through, it looks kind of weird because the colors are too much. I'm gonna scroll in here to the eyes. I can set my opacity to low, and I can go over the eyes here, and this is when it starts to become fun, and you can get some really cool results. Just gonna get a big brush and just go over some of the darker parts here, a little bit on his neck, his hair, a little bit of the background. A little bit under his nose here, so you can see that blood again. A little bit more around the eyes to bring them out. Oh, a little bit more on the actual eyes. The whites of the eyes. And as I'm going through this, I always like to click back and forth to just check what I'm bringing out and making sure everything's going smoothly. And by doing this, I see that the neck here is a little bit too dark as well, and the collar, I kind of lose the collar. It kind of looks like it's bleeding into his head there, and I don't want that. So I'm just going to erase the multiply layer to bring back some detail there. Alright, it's looking good and greasy. Alright, very nice. I'm just going to flatten this, and we can move on to the next step. This is a picture I took in Delhi, India. And I took it at a squatter camp, and the whole camp was based around these huge piles of rocks. And the people that lived there would kind of come out and have big hammers, and the kids and old people had them too, and they would just hit rocks and make them smaller. And I'm sure it was for building something, or they're going to use it for cement or something like that. But I took a walk through it, and I found this little girl, and I decided she'd be interesting to take a picture of because she has a little bit of bread in her hands there. So I took her picture, but when I edit it, I don't really want to edit it like my other pictures, because my other pictures, the editing, it has a commercial feel to it. You can tell that it's edited. This, I want to be able to spice it up and jazz it up a little bit, but I don't want it to have as much of a commercial feel as the other pictures, because I want it to look more like photojournalism. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same multiply technique I talked about in the other tutorial. And duplicate the background layer and just saturate that a bit. But instead of using the brush on this top layer here and just doing it selectively where you choose, I'm going to do something a little bit more constant so the computer has a little bit more control over it, but it gives it more of a real photojournalism effect. And it also saves a little bit of time too. So what I'm going to do is go to Image, Adjustments, and Shadow Highlight. Alrighty. You're presented with a whole bunch of little funky things to play around with. But most of the things you want for this are in the shadow column here. And you can just play around with the radius until you get something that looks natural. Something, I don't know, around the middle looks good for me. What this is doing is all the dark parts on the multiply layer being given a little bit of a boost, just so they're not as faint. Okay, so I'm just going to go back and forth to show you what that looks like, the difference. So you see the difference of doing this versus using a brush. You get a little bit more of a constant result. Now another thing that I do differently when editing something photojournalistic is instead of erasing the multiply layer, I go to the layer behind it and I use dodge and burn tools. So what this is doing is it isn't directly erasing the multiply, but it's brightening what's behind it. So let's put this to the test here. I'm just gonna brighten up her forehead a little bit here because it looks a little bit too dark. So right now I'm just dodging the highlights on 5% exposure and just going slowly. A little bit of the eyes, a little bit under the mouth here. Now you see I'm still getting the same control I did as erasing the multiply layer, but it looks a little bit more natural. We'll go back and forth here. Yeah, looks a little bit more natural, and if you work with it and do a little bit of the midtones too and go over some spots, you can still have a lot of control over the image without having it look too doctored up. I'm just going to go back and forth here just to show you what that did. Now I'm going to turn the multiply layer on and off. Yeah, looks pretty cool. And also you can go in manually with the eraser brush again and kind of just go over parts that you still think are a little bit too dark. You can even do that shadow highlights thing again, you know, just to make sure it's right. You know, I'm going to bring out the scarf here. A little bit of the barrel behind her head also got a little bit too dark, I noticed. You know, just go by eye what looks right and what doesn't. And also, you can use this effect to kind of work on the eyes a little bit. If you want to brighten them up a little bit from the darkness. And I love this lens. This was shot with the 85mm 1.8 prime lens. It's really cheap for what it is, and as you can see, it's really ridiculously sharp. This was at, like, I shot this actually like right at 1.8. No tripod or nothing to control the focus, just me with a reflector in one hand, my shoulder up against a rail. So yeah, so this looks pretty good. So I'm gonna flatten this.